Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michele Storms. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Executive Director at the ACLU of Washington. I'm excited to welcome you to a special Flights and Rights on the anniversary of 9/11. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Coast Salish people, who have stewarded this land for generations. We must never forget the role this country played in stripping our Indigenous relatives of their land, culture, and language. And we must recognize there is so much more work we need to do to make this country fair for the first people and for all people. In the past, you've met many of our wonderful staff members who've been a part of these Flights and Rights presentations. There's a lot of other people who are behind the scenes who you've never seen. We have a tireless board of directors who's been with us in every step of the way in the fight for our civil liberties. So I'm going to give up the screen for just a moment so that members of the board and of our staff can wave hello. And then our board president, Tana Lynn, will share a few words.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tana Lynn. I use she, her pronouns. And on behalf of the board, I want to say thank you all so much for joining us and being invested in what's happening in our democracy. You know, I woke up last week feeling overwhelmed, anxious, and so frustrated by whatever the latest attack on democracy was. But it also made me think about why I choose to be involved with the ACLU. And I'd like to take a few moments to share that with you. I'm an immigrant. And that part of me has always played a large role in my life, worldview, and my career choices. But I've never been forced to feel that part of my identity more than in these past few years. A lot of what's happening in our country now rips me back to around 1972, when I was about 7 years old, minding my own business on a swing at recess, when a much larger, older white girl came up to me and yelled a racial epithet starting with the letter C. Who said you can use the swings? Or words to that effect. And then she shoved me so hard off the swing onto the gravel below that she ripped up the side of my leg, embedding so many tiny rocks under my skin that I couldn't walk for days. And I was asked by the principal what I had done to provoke the girl. And I was the one sent home. And the message was loud and clear. You don't belong here. I long ago forgave that girl because she was just a child. She wasn't responsible for the privilege, lack of empathy, and hate she unleashed on me that day. She was just a child. But that child learned from somewhere that she could act that way, say those kind of hateful things, and treat another girl like she didn't belong. And that's what scares me so much about what's happening in our country today. The message that people don't belong, what it's teaching, and the effects it is having on our children. But not only our children, adults too. Each one of us is a human being that deserves respect and dignity and to belong. And that's why I feel so very privileged to be part of the ACLU Washington family and the work that the ACLU does. The work of the ACLU and the work of our partner organizations tells me, yes, I and so many others do belong here. The work of the ACLU tells those who have paid their debt to society that yes, you belong, and we're here to help you get your right to vote back. The work of the ACLU tells our trans friends that yes, you belong, and we're here to fight for your rights to healthcare. The work of the ACLU tells refugees who have endured so much to escape unimaginable horrors that yes, you belong, and we'll fight for your right to be reunited with your families. The work of the ACLU tells protesters that yes, you belong, and you have an absolute right to be on the streets. And the ACLU will make the police stop unlawfully using chemical and other weapons to silence you. And those are just a few examples. The work of the ACLU is about belonging, making sure that every person is treated with dignity and the respect they deserve, and fighting so that every person can exercise the civil rights that belongs to them. So on behalf of myself and the ACLU of Washington board, I want to thank each one of you for being a part of the ACLU community for participating in an organization that believes in belonging, and for helping this organization that is truly one of the beacons of light in the times that we're in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tana. I feel so lucky that you are a member of our board and that you were able to represent our board speaking here today. Your own story and your own experience, I know, resonates with many, and thank you for sharing it. So let me step back and do a little housekeeping about our event. Those of you who have been here before know our history with our flights and rights, where we've typically hosted them in breweries and event spaces around the state, often at KEXP 90.3 FM or KEXP.org. In addition to KEXP's generosity and support, each in-person flights and rights was sponsored by a local brewery. I hope you'll check out the chat box for a link to support our partner breweries. The COVID-19 times are difficult times for small businesses, and we want to continue to support those, especially the ones who've supported us. So now let me get to the meat of the conversation for this evening. Tonight is the 19th anniversary of 9/11, and we reflect on lives tragically lost, workers, first responders, mothers, fathers, children, friends, beloved humans lost or injured, lives changed immeasurably forever. The 9/11 tragedy impacted so many lives then and continues to have impacts even to this day. We remember all of those people right now, silently, for just one moment. We also reflect, in this time of remembrance, on the many laws and policies that followed 9/11 that continue to hurt Americans. In the name of national security, Congress passed the Patriot Act 45 days after 9/11. It was the first of many changes to laws, particularly surveillance laws, that made it easier for the government to spy on ordinary Americans. The Patriot Act expanded the state's authority to monitor phone and email communications, collect bank and credit reporting records, and track the activity of just regular people using the internet. While most Americans think it was created to catch terrorists, the Patriot Act actually turns regular people in this country into suspects, and it's still in effect. Tonight, we will revisit its origins and explore its continued impact. So let me tell you about our speakers. We're first going to hear from Jennifer Lee, who's the Technology and Liberty Manager at the ACLU of Washington. Jennifer joined the ACLU of Washington in January of 2019 and works on pushing for transparent and accountable technology policies that center community voices. Jen has a master's in public policy from the University of Cambridge, a bachelor's degree in international studies, public health, and sociology from Johns Hopkins University. She was previously a Google Policy Fellow, where she worked on issues regarding genetic data, algorithmic discrimination, and international privacy laws. Jennifer's job is to ensure that the explosion of technology in our society respects people's privacy, is fair and accountable to everyone, and advances our constitutional rights and freedoms. I'm also just thrilled to have with us Sahar Fathi. Sahar is the Policy Director for the Washington State Attorney General's Office. Sahar graduated from the University of Washington Law School and is a member of the New York Bar. She also earned a master's in international studies from the University of Washington and graduated cum laude from the University of Southern California with a dual Bachelor of Arts in French and International Relations. Sahar also attended the Sorbonne University and received a diploma in International and European Law from the Université Jean Moulin in 2008. Previously, she served as a senior legislative analyst on central staff at King County, the division director for external relations, and the leadership development division director at the Department of Neighborhoods in the city of Seattle. She's also a past president and co-founder of the Middle Eastern Legal Association of Washington, as well as the founder of its legal clinic, the first Middle Eastern legal clinic in the country. She's a current board member of One America Votes and a past board member for the ACLU, the Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project, and the UNA USA. So let's get started. Jen, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Lee, and I'm the Tech and Liberty Manager here at the ACLU of Washington, and it's really great to be here with you all tonight. As Michelle mentioned, it's been 19 years since the tragic events of September 11th, 2001. And since then, government surveillance, and particularly government surveillance of marginalized communities, has really only increased, not decreased. The passage of the Patriot Act in October of 2001, just weeks after 9/11, and other surveillance programs launched shortly thereafter, have enabled many surveillance abuses and have resulted in direct harms to marginalized communities. The ability of government to inflict such abuses and harms have only grown over the time with the rise of powerful data and AI-based tools. Today, increasingly powerful surveillance technology is being used to track protesters, exercising their constitutional rights, and new surveillance threats have arisen in times of emergency, like the pandemic we're in right now. I'm going to first talk a little bit about the Patriot Act and talk about how this act and other surveillance programs launched before and after 9/11 have often wrongly targeted individuals on the basis of race, religion, or political views. I'll then talk about how new technologies have amplified existing threats, not only to already marginalized communities, but also for all Americans. So first, what is the Patriot Act? As many folks know, the Patriot Act was ostensibly designed to enable the government to fight terrorism and was a direct response to 9/11. But the law was really more about expanding government surveillance power than it was about fighting terrorism. The law expanded national security surveillance and brought about a range of institutional changes, such as facilitating greater information sharing between government agencies, expanding the definition of terrorism, but most importantly, it massively expanded the government's surveillance powers. Congress passed the act far too quickly and with much too little scrutiny of some of the bill's most problematic provisions, and didn't adequately consider just how broadly parts of it could be used in the future. The 363-page bill was passed into law just 45 days after 9/11, and this extremely short timeline gave members of Congress who were afraid of looking un-American in the wake of a national tragedy very little time to read, understand, and debate what they were voting on. The Patriot Act amended a pre-existing law called FISA, or the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was passed in 1978. FISA governs all foreign intelligence and national security surveillance authorized by Congress, and it authorizes the government to obtain warrants to surveil individual targets based on probable cause that they're an agent of foreign power. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or the FISA Court, which was also created as part of the law, approves these warrants. And since 1978, when FISA was passed, it's expanded dramatically, and it expands every time laws like the Patriot Act build onto FISA. The Patriot Act has enabled far too many surveillance abuses, and it was always more about expanding surveillance than it was about fighting terrorism. We know that because the US government collected Americans' phone records in bulk long before it used Section 215 of the Patriot Act as justification to do so. What the Patriot Act did was legitimize invasive, suspicionless, and discriminatory profiling of already over-surveilled communities. A recently leaked FBI intelligence assessment indicated that the agency is targeting Black activists as quote-unquote extremists, and media disclosures revealed that the government used FISA to spy on prominent Muslim Americans who were never charged with committing a crime. Recently, affirming previous rulings, our courts have found that the government has used the Patriot Act illegally and unconstitutionally. In December of 2019, the FISA court found that the FBI has in many cases violated rules surrounding the government's warrantless wiretapping program, which is governed under Section 702 of FISA since 2008. This section allows the government to engage in mass warrantless surveillance of Americans and foreigners' phone calls, our text messages, emails, and any other electronic communications. Information collected under the law without a warrant can be used to prosecute and imprison people, even for crimes that have nothing to do with national security. Earlier this month, on September 2nd, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the NSA's bulk collection of Americans' call records under a now defunct NSA program that operated under Section 215 of the Patriot Act was illegal. With these examples, we can see how granting government sweeping powers to surveil ordinary Americans during times of crisis, during times of tragedy, can have impacts that last for decades beyond that crisis. Even though the Patriot Act has clearly been abused and has led to and contributed to racial profiling, wrongful accusations of ordinary Americans, and unconstitutional surveillance over entire religious and ethnic groups, the law has persisted for a very long time and continues to persist now. Earlier this year, in March of 2020, 3 important sections of the Patriot Act expired. First was a roving wiretaps provision. Second was a provision called the lone wolf provision. And lastly, and very importantly, Section 215 expired, which was a section that allowed the NSA to collect and store phone records or call details records from thousands of Americans not under investigation by the federal government. Congress was scheduled to vote on a bill that would have extended provisions of the Patriot Act that expired in March. We've stated that these provisions are currently not consistent with Americans' fundamental rights and have stated that the legislation fails to address the many surveillance abuses allowed via the provisions. Congress wasn't able to reach agreement on this bill before they went on recess in August. So for now, these provisions are expired, and it's unclear when they'll be revisited. What is really important to note here is that surveillance didn't just start with 9/11 or the Patriot Act. Surveillance of Black and Indigenous communities, people of color, religious and ethnic minorities, sexual and gender minorities, and political groups has existed since the founding of our country. There are many examples throughout history, but I'll just name a few. In 1713, New York City passed what was called the Lantern Law, requiring only Black, Indigenous people to illuminate themselves by carrying a lit candle at night, which was the technology of the time, and this incentivized white citizens to enforce slave systems and incarceration. I think we can say that candles are neither advanced nor high tech, but different groups still suffered disproportionately from targeting and surveillance with the use of this tool. In the 1930s and the 40s, the US government subcontracted with IBM, which provided its Hollerith punch card machines to surveil and target Japanese Americans via census data. Japanese Americans were surveilled and put on custodial detention lists using this data for nearly a decade prior to being unconstitutionally incarcerated during World War II. And in the 1960s, the FBI with its COINTELPRO program targeted anti-war Vietnam protesters as well as civil rights movements. In 1969, the NYPD indicted the Panther 21 members from the Black Panther Party on over 100 unfounded conspiracy charges as a result of COINTELPRO surveillance. They gathered identifying information about civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., via wiretapping systems and photos taken by informants. While surveillance of marginalized groups in this country isn't new, what has changed has been the sophistication and power of surveillance technologies. We can see that in NYPD's use of automated license plate readers or ALPRs to power its broad, decade-long spying program in which law enforcement surveilled people at mosques using ALPR technology to collect massive amounts of data about people just going about their lives. While this program was eventually struck down as illegal, the ruling doesn't rectify the harms that were already inflicted on the Muslim and Arab communities. Today, we're seeing technologies truly unprecedented in their surveillance power, like facial recognition, location tracking, drones, and other AI-based tools, being used by the same agencies that have and continue to brutalize the lives of Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized communities. It's also important to note that today, because data-driven technology has permeated throughout so much of our society, technology deployed for a seemingly innocuous or even beneficial purpose can very easily be used for a less innocuous purpose. For example, recently in San Diego, police looked for Black Lives Matter protesters in records of smart streetlights. These streetlights were intended to contribute to sustainability, and the cameras and sensors were to gather pedestrian and vehicle data supposedly to be used for city planning purposes. But this footage that was collected for seemingly innocuous purposes was actively combed through by San Diego police to surveil and indict protesters exercising their constitutional right to protest. With COVID-19, we're also seeing the same companies that have partnered with law enforcement agencies and have provided them with technologies like face recognition, now partnering with public health agencies to help fight this pandemic. Clearview AI, a company ACLU is suing for promoting unlawful, privacy-destroying face surveillance activities, is one such company. In times of crisis like 9/11, like COVID-19, it's incredibly important to make sure our policy responses don't create overreaching, unlawful and unnecessary surveillance. With COVID-19, for example, we have to make sure that any privacy intrusions are necessary and proportionate, rooted in science and public health, and limited to a specific need. We saw the Patriot Act being routinely abused by government to conduct massive amounts of surveillance, and more often than not, these investigations were totally unrelated to national security purposes. We should be wary of increased surveillance, understanding how difficult it is to roll back an infrastructure once you build and legitimize it. When we talk about surveillance technologies today, we often focus on how to fix the inaccuracies and the terrible race and gender biases within these modern technologies. And often with that, there's an assumption that making a technology perfectly accurate will solve all the problems. But history has shown us that technologies as simple as a candle can be used to uphold incarceral and slave systems and contribute to inequity. And technologies today are a lot more powerful than candles and can be used to further a lot more inequity. We need to be thinking about how technologies and policies legitimizing surveillance will operate in the context of a structurally inequitable society, and whether and how it makes sense for such technologies and policies to actually exist. So with that, I will turn it over back to Michele.
Thank you, Jen. And Sahar, we'd just love to hear from you now.
A lot of unmuting. I just want to say thank you for having me, and just really impressed with the caliber of the speakers tonight. And before I start, what I always have to say is what I talk about is my personal view and not necessarily representative of what the Attorney General's office stands for, but it is also the perspective of a Muslim growing up in this country. So I'm going to start a little bit with my personal story, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the United States and interacting with the Middle East, and in particular with Iran, because that is my lived experience. It's going to be a little bit more conversational, unfortunately. So I was born to two Iranian immigrants who came on student visas to this country on the eve of the revolution in Iran, which was in 1979. My mother was on the last flight out before the revolution happened. My parents couldn't go back to Iran, and so they stayed here and they had me. And I was born in Boston. And while I have spent many summers and many extended holidays in Iran, I've never lived there full time. I do have a lot of family there. My aunts, my uncles, my cousins, my grandparents, they all still live in Iran. And many of them are impacted today by the Muslim ban, which I'll also talk about a little bit as well. I think my career and my life really changed on 9/11 for different reasons from probably other folks on this call. The 9/11 happened a week after I started college. So now you all know my age. Please don't share it in the chat. And I was sitting in an international relations class, and an email went out that said, if you're Muslim, you need to walk with a buddy today. The mosque is getting bomb threats on the hour, and we're worried about your safety. And I remember sitting next to a friend of mine who was from Kuwait, and there was an empty row of seats around us because nobody would sit with us that week, and the rest of the class was packed. And I think that was the day that I really understood that even though I had been born here and that I felt American, and that my Iranian family members in Iran thought I was American, that I didn't really get to grieve America like my white counterparts did on 9/11, that I wasn't equal anymore, and that things were really going to drastically change. The Patriot Act did pass shortly after that, and that summer, my first summer after 9/11, I actually went on to the ACLU to do my first internship, and that I was a little baby ACLUer, and I got a youth scholarship to go to a conference. And I remember very distinctly that it was, the keynote speaker was an Iranian woman who was suing the US government on the Patriot Act. And I was so excited because I'd never seen an Iranian woman do anything like that before. And we got to the airport, and it was me and the entire ACLU of Washington staff standing in line, some of whom still work there. And the kiosks had just been implemented in CTAC, and I entered my name in the kiosk, and the kiosk went black. And the woman from behind the kiosk came over, and she said, "I'm going to need to see your ID." And she took it for probably 20, 30 minutes, came back, and she said, "I can't let you get on this flight. You're on the no-fly list." And I was 18, so now you really know my age. I was wearing a USC sweatshirt. Not that that should mean anything, but I don't think I had any idea what the no-fly list was. And why I was on it. And I think she was pretty perplexed too. She tried to explain it to me, and she said, "We can't let you fly. You are perceived to be dangerous." And when I later wrote about it in the ACLU newsletter, it was the first time I'd ever written anything like that. And I said, what she didn't realize was I had the entire ACLU of Washington staff standing behind me, and it really wasn't a good look for them. And the ACLU did go on and sue on the no-fly list. Actually, one of the lead attorneys had my name, my last name. We had the same last name, and I got to meet him later on. From there, I decided to go to law school, for better or worse, if you ask my mother. And I spent my first summer after my first year in law school, my 1L summer, actually at the ACLU again. The same attorney who had sued on the no-fly list convinced me to go back, and he said, "This is your calling." And he was right, because I think, if you come from a Middle Eastern background, you probably are very similar to me in that your parents think that you should be a certain kind of attorney and never speak up and say bad things because you could get in trouble and be on things like the no-fly list. So that didn't work out for me, and I went to the ACLU anyway. I got my master's degree, and I focused on Iranian U.S. history, and I co-founded the Middle Eastern Legal Association of Washington, and it was the first legal clinic in the country for Middle Easterners. And our first case, I remember very distinctly, we got from the ACLU, from CARE in the ACLU, CARE Washington, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and it was a white woman in a car trying to run over a woman in a hijab and telling her to go back to her country. And it was, 2011 at that time. And these were still very normal things that were happening in the Muslim community and to people who look like my family and who look like me. From there, I spent many years advocating. There have been a lot of bills that have passed through Congress that impact Middle Easterners, and I'm sure many of you have tracked them because you're all good advocates. One of the ones that I will point out in 2015 was the visa waiver program, which sort of paved the way for the Muslim ban, and that was actually under the Obama administration. And then, of course, the Muslim ban passed in 2017, and I spent many early mornings at CTAC before work at 4 a.m. volunteering to help impacted families because there weren't a lot of attorneys who spoke Farsi. I want to apologize. I have a 2-year-old that you might be hearing in the background, and he's trying really hard to stay quiet. Family. So I want to pivot a little and talk about Iranian history because I think it's really important. A lot of people think, 9/11 happened and suddenly Iranians became terrorists, or they know a little bit about the hostage crisis, but I don't think a lot of folks really understand sort of the political implications of what's been going on and the diplomatic relations that have never really existed between Iran and the United States. And that really, there's a lot there and sort of unpacking what it means to be a terrorist in this country, or sort of terrorist adjacent and from the Middle East. That is some Middle Eastern humor. I'm just going to continue with my bad mom jokes. Okay. So many of you probably know Iran is the 4th largest oil producer in the world. Back in the 1900s, Iran, all of Iran's oil was controlled by the Brits. And in the 1950s, Iran had a monarchy. It was run by the Shah. And in the 1950s, the Iranian parliament put forward a proposal for a democratically elected prime minister. And the Iranians voted, and his name was Mohammad Mossadegh. And he was voted democratically. And most of his platform was around nationalizing Iranian oil and taking back power over Iranian oil. The Shah was pretty upset about it. He saw it as a threat to his power. And the Brits were upset because they saw it as a threat to the power they had over Iranian oil. And so they worked with the United States. And when the Eisenhower administration came into power, the Eisenhower administration and the CIA worked with the Brits to overthrow Mossadegh. They overthrew him in a coup that was staged. They did a lot of lying and bribery and posing as communists and doing all these different things to create fear tactics, and eventually drove him out. And then they reached a new oil agreement with the Shah in which 8 different companies got control over Iranian oil, and they were a mix of British and US oil companies. And the Iranian people were very upset because they felt like the Shah was corrupt, that he was in the back pocket of the United States, of the Brits, and that he was not going to do good things for the country, and he didn't. For 20 years, the Shah was very corrupt. People disappeared. He used Iranian revenue from the oil to buy arms, and the Iranian people never saw any of it. So when the revolution happened in 1979, I think it was not shocking to anybody who studied Iranian history, but it was probably shocking to the rest of the world. I don't think the Iranians realized what Khomeini would be when he came into office and came into power, but I also don't think that the United States really, I think they underestimated the Iranian people and their desire to be free. I think the piece that I want to talk about a little bit here is, in addition to sort of heavy meddling of the United States in the Iranian government and the feelings that Iranians have and Muslims have, and Iran is one of 4 Islamic republics in the world. It is entirely Muslim. It is there are a lot of religious minorities, but it's something like 90% Shia. And in addition, the United States has also placed many sanctions on Iran, and those sanctions have oppressed the people and really made it very difficult for anyone to see anything beyond like being able to pay for basic needs. Even right now, a lot of people have commented on how COVID has been so prevalent in Iran because of the sanctions and the inability to get basic medication. And that kind of anger and upsetness, and it sort of fuels this hostility against the American people that I think is in many ways misportrayed by the media and sort of taken advantage of. I think the only other thing I want to say is the United States never really stopped meddling, right? When the Bush administration, post 9/11, declared the axis of evil, Iran was part of the axis of evil. When declared the war on terror, right? Those are all countries that were adjacent to Iran, and there were specific military strategies happening, and 37 million people were displaced from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from all of these other countries, and that created a lot of refugees that went in and out of Iran as well. And even this year, when you saw, I don't know if you were tracking, but if you saw General Soleimani was killed by drone strike by Trump, he was active with Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War, and the United States backed Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War. So I guess what I would just say is, a lot of folks just see the one terrorist attack, which didn't really include Iranians, and then they see the Muslim ban and they think, well, these Muslims are terrible people and they're all terrorists. And I want to just point out that there is often a lot of back and forth history where the United States has done a lot of overreach, and that should be taken into consideration as well.
Thank you so much, both of you. And, such powerful information. Thank you for the history lesson, Sahar, as well as for the personal story, which is so important, because if we're going to understand who we are as a country, who our people are, what we're all about, we need to know each other's stories, and there's more to everything than what necessarily meets the eye. And Jen, so appreciative of just the breakdown of the Patriot Act, which I think is something that has been very confusing for a lot of people. And as you pointed out, it was how many hundreds of pages, and nobody maybe who voted on it even actually read the whole thing. And so, right, we have a lot of work to do. So I have some questions for both of you, and I think we have some audience questions beginning to come in as well. And so here's this. You know, Jen, you really talked about the Patriot Act as really a way to solidify surveillance, right, in our country, and surveillance is dangerous in so many ways. How can people push back against government surveillance, particularly when quite often we don't even know what the tools are that are being used and how they're being used?
That is a huge issue. I mean, it really is, because especially with the sophistication of new technologies, often members of the public don't even know what tools agencies are using to surveil folks, but not just surveil folks, also using these new tools to make important decisions about our lives, including what type of healthcare we receive, if we do not get bail, or how long our sentence is. All of these really, really important decisions are being made in addition to surveillance being a key part of these tools. Because what's important to remember is a lot of surveillance tools now are AI-based, along with a lot of other technologies government is using. At the ACLU of Washington, we've really pushed for laws requiring agencies to make public any surveillance tools they're using, as well as creating a process by which the public has some say in deciding whether technologies get acquired and deployed at all. In Seattle, we have the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance that does just that. It requires a process by which agencies using any surveillance technology have to submit it to the public for public comment and review. And there's a community input process by which new rules are decided upon based on whether the technology is or is not appropriate to be used on the public. But it's also really important to know what kinds of questions to ask policymakers. It's hard to, when you don't even know technologies are being used to surveil you, where do you even know where to start? So I think that first part that I mentioned about seeking transparency is important, but once you have some understanding of what technologies are being used, it's also important to ask critical questions about those technologies. This year, the ACLU of Washington partnered with the Critical Platform Studies Group and the Tech Fairness Coalition in Washington to build an algorithmic equity toolkit that's designed to help folks more easily identify surveillance and AI-based tools. But also within that toolkit, we have a questionnaire for folks to ask policymakers questions like, if the technology works completely accurately, does the technology still perpetuate injustice? What say do impacted community members have in how the system is implemented, including where and when the system is used? We include questions like, can community members object and have their objections meaningfully heard? How can the public access and correct system records? What are the explicitly intended and allowable uses of the system? And are there oversight mechanisms in place? I think these are the types of questions that folks have to really ask policymakers in order to, not only, I think it's also to get policymakers to start thinking about these questions, because so often we operate under the assumption that more technology equals better, when so often, as Sahar just mentioned, that's not the case. More surveillance is not always better. In fact, it's markedly worse, and in fact will exacerbate structural inequities. So those are a few steps, but Michelle, it is definitely super difficult to do so without transparency.
And I think it's just very true that so many people really have no idea the myriad ways that surveillance is already in use. And, like your example of San Diego earlier, the lights that were just supposed to, mark traffic then being used against BLM protesters. Sahar, I'd like to turn to you and just on this question of surveillance, and because of course a big piece of this surveillance was coming out of the Patriot Act was increased surveillance over Muslim and Arab communities. And so I was wondering if you could speak to what are the domestic and global impacts of that surveillance on these communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jen did a wonderful job sort of explaining sort of the extent of the Patriot Act, right? It allowed the Bush administration to wiretap its citizens without judicial or legislative oversight. It meant that you could detain people as a material witness without habeas corpus rights, which means that they could just detain people and a person couldn't go to court to determine whether or not their detention was lawful. And I don't think I need to say much more than Guantanamo Bay to sort of put into reality what that meant for a lot of Muslims who were suddenly being accused of something based on the surveillance and what the United States government determined would make them threatening, and then their inability to do anything about it, which I think is what really makes this country great, right? The idea that you have a day in court, the idea that you can access the justice system is why people come to America, and that is the beauty of our democracy. I also think it permeates this surreal power over people of color, and particularly Muslims and Arabs, that is terrifying, right? Your government can now spy on you. They can make their own determination as to what they think you are. They can detain you. They can call you a terrorist. And really, when we think about how the government sort of manipulates the word and the media manipulates the word about terrorism and who it's being applied to, it really just reinforces this idea of othering and making sort of systemic racial profiling the norm, right? People sort of see Muslims and they automatically think, are you a terrorist on my plane, right? They sort of sit down next to you and they wonder. And we know that in New York, for example, I mean, there's been reports done. NYPD surveilled Muslim communities for years. They had their privacy taken away. There was actually, I don't know if people know this, but right after 9/11, there was a Gallup poll that was taken of American people and sort of how they felt about the state of the country. And 1 in 3 Americans actually favored heightened scrutiny of Arabs. And in particular, they would have been in favor of putting Arabs in internment camps. And what I think is really interesting when we sort of think about this is that the history repeats itself, right? This happened with the Pearl Harbor with the Japanese population, that there is a fear that people need to be checked, they need to be imprisoned, and we need to watch them because they could be dangerous, right? And this sort of artificial presentation of what is dangerous and a certain population getting to impose that power structure on others. And then I think globally, I mean, we've talked about this, right? The war on terror that came out of 9/11, the reality of it was that 37 million people have been displaced, right? It's been 20 years. We are still, I don't think people really think about those consequences when they are looking at the rest of the world, because we don't see that in our day-to-day in this country. But if you go over to the Middle East, I think you will really see a horrific sort of damaging displacement of people it will take decades to undo that and rebuild those systems. And I don't know that we really even know how to begin doing that. So a little bit like a Debbie Downer right now.
That is just, it's discouraging, it's disturbing, it's heartrending. But thank you for speaking the truth about it, right? Because people need to understand. So, let me get this one question that came from the audience, and both of you may have something to say about this. And the question was, could the Patriot Act be adequately limited or narrowed, or does it need to be repealed entirely? So if you have some thoughts about that, I know neither of you is like technically an expert on, national security law per se, but I bet you both have something to say about that. So yeah, Sahar, you're already unmuted. You want to go?
I mean, I've been unmuted the whole time. Let's talk about my technology skills another time. I am, my career, and I obviously yield to Jen because she has sort of the subject matter expertise here, but as a person who has written a lot of legislation and who sort of deals in policy, I prefer to start from scratch instead of trying to amend something that never worked to begin with. So I personally feel like repealing and then sort of working over with the right people and sort of thinking about what the actual policy goals are there and whether it's actually necessary would be my preferred approach. That is just me.
Thank you. Jen?
I agree with Sahar in her approach. And I think at the very least, it's clear that some pieces of the act should be repealed outright at a minimum, because they're just so egregious. And the two sections I'm thinking about are the sections that I mentioned previously, sections 215 and 702. In 2015, Congress actually passed the USA Freedom Act in a bipartisan effort to address revelations that the NSA had abused provisions of the Patriot Act to obtain the personal information of virtually every single American. And you know, this act was to remedy a lot of the concerns. But since the passage of the USA Freedom Act in 2015, it's become clear that it didn't succeed in limiting unwarranted surveillance under the Patriot Act and other intelligence laws. So, you know, Section 215 of the Patriot Act continues to still be used to collect vast amounts of American sensitive information under a standard far more permissive than a warrant. And the government refuses to disclose the types of records it believes it can collect under the authority. So I think that those sections, along with other sections at a minimum, should be repealed completely. And like Sahar said, this bill was never, it was always about surveillance. And the intent was to surveil those who are historically, who have been historically marginalized, and it harmed so many people and continues to harm so many people. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thanks, both of you. That's all very real. So how about this? You know, the Patriot Act arises out of this feeling that we need to do something to protect our country and protect our people. So how do we talk about the need for security in times of public emergency, in times of a terrorist attack, COVID-19, you know, without sacrificing people's civil liberties or without harming marginalized communities, right? And so Jen, I'm going to direct this one to you for your comment.
Well, I think that it's important that fear doesn't drive our conversations about the need for security. I think we see that in times of crisis, the groups that have always been the most harmed will be disproportionately impacted and harmed, and will be the first groups to be thrown under the bus in the name of security. We see that with 9/11. We see that today with a lot of other crises. And I'm afraid we're seeing that with COVID-19, where the most impacted members of our society are, again, the most impacted and are disproportionately harmed. With any policy passed during and to address times of crisis, we really need to make sure that these policies are restricted to very specific purposes, have enforcement mechanisms to ensure that those purposes are not broadened beyond their initial goals. We need to make sure that any such policies will not have discriminatory impacts. And we need to have an exit plan so that any policies or technologies or tools or projects put in place to address a crisis doesn't actually last beyond that crisis. And unlike the deliberation around the Patriot Act, policies that potentially infringe upon privacy and civil liberties have to be deliberated on carefully, you know, in more time than 45 days after a crisis happens, and very, very importantly, with community leadership. And this doesn't mean that community input is solicited. This means that the voices of marginalized communities are actually listened to and are given power and are deferred to in the process of creating these policies, with an understanding of the historical impact of such policies. You know, that's continuing today and has continued to further structural inequity.
That was so beautifully said, and I really appreciate that. And I think that's very much an ACLU position. Let us, if we need to do something that might be restrictive, let's do it in the least restrictive way, in the least harmful way, and that is directly tailored to solve the problem we're trying to solve, without unduly impinging on the rights of other folks. This leads me to something that I think it would be great for Sahar to speak to, which is, because we're talking about how communities can be adversely impacted by surveillance or so-called laws or policies in favor of public safety. What are some of the links that you see between the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the oppressive systems that have plagued the Muslim and Iranian communities?
Yeah, and I think Jen really pointed it out astutely when she was talking about sort of policies that happened in the 1700s, right? The Muslim ban, the War on Terror, the Patriot Act, these are all versions of policies that were originally built to oppress and destroy Black communities, right? And I think if we sort of center around this idea that this is not new, that these are sort of systems of the United States government that is unfortunately normative in this country, really, that the power construct around Black folks and white folks and othering is really just being repeated in the Muslim community, then I think, especially, and I say this a lot to the Muslim community, I say this is why we need to ally with Black Lives Matter, right? Because if we don't undo that systemic oppression and that systemic racism, it will continue to manifest itself. You cannot just treat the symptom, which happens to be the Patriot Act right now. You need to sort of go back to where it originally formulated. The other thing I talk a lot about is that there is also like a lot of connection between the Black community and the Muslim community. In the 1960s, there was Malcolm X, there was the Nation of Islam, there was Muhammad Ali, and the Iranian Revolution that happened in 79. And it was really this easy target in many ways for the media and for the American government to sort of other Muslims and say, Islam is now being equated with terrorism, and let's manipulate the story, and let's use the same system that oppressed Black people and that continues to oppress Black people and place it over here to the Middle Easterners and the Muslims and continue to do what has always worked for us. And I don't think it has to be deep or complex, right? But I think if we don't see that pattern and we don't name it and address it head on, then we are continuing to sort of play around the sidelines of what is the real issue at the end of the day. And that I fully believe that we have to start with the Black Lives Matter movement. We have to start with undoing the impacts of slavery and the systemic racism that has been in this country forever, to be able to then continue on with things like the Patriot Act, things like the Muslim ban, things like whatever the next iteration is going to be 10 years from now.
I really appreciate those reflections, and you're right, the oppressive systems will continue to produce and reproduce, right, to the next target. And so we want to see a system where there's not that othering and belonging, right? Or that the othering without the belonging, right? Okay. So one of the other audience questions that arose about NSA and FISA, which Jen had referred to earlier, this person says those abuses are well documented, and yet it's renewed repeatedly. Like, so those acts continue to be renewed. And so the question is, how do you get accountability? Pressure on politicians has failed. Is it going to take a lawsuit? What is it going to take to have these accountability problems be addressed? So if either of you have a reflection on that, that would be great. And I say that both of you perhaps should be running for Congress so that we have the proper voices out there. I'm just throwing it out there. But anyway, carry on. Go ahead.
I was going to say, right, like I always turn this back onto people who ask this question, and I say, well, have you ever thought about running for office? Have you ever thought about being that change, right? Because I do think power is held with the representatives that we have and people holding them accountable, right? Like, your vote does matter. Now is the perfect time to talk about that. We are about to enter into a moment when we can start holding people accountable. And I also think that, I wouldn't discount every single elected official we have, and maybe that is optimistic of me, but we have some amazing congressional representatives in our state and in Congress who are really, I think, starting to talk about things that I never thought I would hear the day, right? Like, you think about Representative Jayapal. I mean, like, she is kicking ass and taking names. Am I allowed to say that? This is the ACLU. I'm allowed to say that word. And I can't wait to see what's next, right? And I think we have different layers of government, and I think a lot of times people, get preoccupied, and I'm not saying anyone in the audience is getting preoccupied, but it's not just Congress and president, right? Like, we got council, we got to talk about boards, we got to talk about commissions. There are so many levels of government in which people can be holding those positions and be in public office and influence those ideas and policies. And I would love to see more people fight for that and really represent the public voice.
Right. I think that's wonderful. And it doesn't have to all be at the national level, right? I think about a lot of the work that Jen does with city councils around the state and with the port. There are so many places where decision makers have the ability to set policy that is fair and that represents inclusion and not exclusion. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. We're getting a little low on time. Jen, if you would like to respond at all to that last question, I definitely want you to have the chance to do that. And then what I want you both to be thinking about is another audience question that came. And this is great because this is how we always like to end off anything, which is what are some of the actionable items that the average person can do in order to push these issues farther into the light and help lead towards solutions. So Jen, if you want to speak to the other question, you can have it. And if not, I'd love to hear the response to just what can folks do?
To the first audience question, I think Sahar answered beautifully. But one thing I will mention is that there have been many lawsuits against the Patriot Act because so many sections have been deemed unconstitutional and totally privacy invasive and very harmful to so many communities. On this last audience question about what folks can do, I think it's kind of what Michelle said at the very end. It's engaging in actually local politics more than, state politics and federal politics is very important, but you can have a huge impact in what's happening in your community. And I just want to highlight a few examples, maybe a lot of examples. So, this week we saw in Portland, a neighboring city, they just banned public and private use of facial recognition, private uses in places of public accommodation, making it the broadest facial recognition ban in the US. That's on the local level, and it shows what can be done on the state and federal level. On the federal level, there are federal moratoria on facial recognition being contemplated, but a city doing that is huge, and it sets a precedent. And, in Seattle, there's so many venues in which you can engage. So Seattle City Council, or your local council in Washington, but also your ports. And a conversation we're engaging with recently is whether or not the port should adopt certain types of uses of facial recognition. And, this is really, really important because ports are both local and federal entities. And if folks engaging and knowing about what's happening at the port actually has a huge impact on other ports happening nationwide. So, that's the decision that's going to be made pretty soon in October. So I definitely encourage folks to chime in and look at the port website and see what's happening. But this is really applicable to many other types of local government. And again, run for office.
And I guess I'll just jump in and say, I 100% agree with Jen. I spent most of my career working in local government, and I think I can't tell you how many times constituent emails have made a difference in what people have decided to do in office, and how many ideas constituents have brought through in terms of boards and commissions. I think a lot of folks think, oh, who listens to that? But we listen. I have been told if the community wants this, let's do it. And so it is elect the people, be the change, you run for office, and then listen to the people who are most impacted. Make sure that they are also being heard and including them in that process. I think Jen was really clear about that and sort of how we change the Patriot Act for better. And it is using your platform to lift up the most impacted people and making sure that they are meaningfully engaging and that we are supporting their voices, I think is key.
That's really excellent. You two are absolutely wonderful, and it's been amazing to hear you share your views and your truths and what you've learned. So just as we close out, I'm just thinking, right, like we always talk about 9/11 as a tragedy, and it was, right, but it wasn't a singular tragedy. Like so many things in our world, there are multiple truths that arise out of this. So there was the tragedy of 9/11, that was the loss of life, right? That was a devastating loss of life for the folks in the towers and so on. But there's also the tragedy of 9/11, that is the harm to the Muslim and Arab communities, the ongoing discrimination, the ongoing sense that good people in these communities are other or foreign or dangerous, and the displacement that Sahar shared about that all around the world that these communities continue to face. The tragedy of 9/11 is also like the increase in the surveillance state, the surveillance against the people in the country, the restriction of our rights and our freedoms in the name of so-called national security. So like I said, it's a story with a lot of truths and a lot of tragedies, and it illustrates that we have so much more work to do. So we're doing the work, we're in the work. I'm so grateful to the folks who came here to listen today. And to ask your wonderful questions and to be educated and to be thinking about what you can do to make our world more fair and just and equitable to all the people, because all the people belong. And thank you so much to Jen and Sahar for your expertise, which is just wonderful, and also your passion and your heart. And thank you to our behind the scenes crew, the ACLU, who are back there making this program happening once again. You all just ace it every single time. You make it so seamless. So folks, have a good evening. Take good care of yourselves. If you're in a smoky region, don't breathe too much smoke. And please remember, we're having another Flights and Rights on October 14th. We'll be talking about the election, so that'll be a topic worthy of tuning in for. Everyone, take good care. Have a great evening. Thanks so much for joining us.